like to turn it over to Chairman Langworthy. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jessica. And thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your day to join us. This is, I think, our 7th or 8th week hosting Zoom video town hall meetings. They've been extraordinarily successful. It's a great way, as we've been in this, lockdown period, for us to communicate with members of the party, whether it's committee members, district leaders, contributors, volunteers. I mean, we have people from all walks of life within the Republican Party that have participated in these town hall meetings. Hopefully you've gotten to see a nice cross section of some of our great candidates, elected leaders, local levels. It's, I think, been a very successful series that we are going to continue once we get back to normal, because it's so much easier for you to tune in. Not that I won't be out on the road, traveling the state, but to tune in once a week as we bring important Republican content to you to show you what the New York State Republican Party is doing. And I'm coming up on the 1-year mark as chairman. It's something I was very dedicated to showing that this party is alive and well in this state, and that's why we're here today. We're not going to shy away from any issues. We're going to talk about things, that are tough. And this has been an incredibly painful and trying week for our nation and our state and our communities. But I know that, for many Black Americans, the pain didn't start this week. And that's why we're here. And we all watched in horror as George Floyd begged for his life. We watched violence and chaos overtake our cities, and our businesses and neighborhoods have been destroyed. We've also witnessed beautiful moments of peaceful protest, and law enforcement officers like NYPD Chief Monahan kneel hand in hand with members of the community. But this morning, unfortunately, we wake up praying for the recovery of officers who were shot and stabbed last night in Brooklyn. We must take action, and it's a privilege for me. It's the honor of a lifetime for me to serve as the chairman of the New York Republican Party. And I view this as my obligation and as a duty for us as a party to do our part to bring positive change to help unite us. As Republicans, our core principle is that all men and women are created equal under God. We are the party of Lincoln, who abolished slavery. We are the party who wants to lift everyone up and believes deeply in the individual spirit and the power that comes with freedom. But we know we all need to do better. We know that as a society, as Americans, we fail without equality and justice for all. So the best way to start that process is by listening, is by having the tough and honest and thoughtful discussions, and then put together action. This isn't about reacting to a news cycle. We don't want to find ourselves in the same place a year from now, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now as problems continue to grow. I want to seize this moment and find good that we can bring from it. We are not even close to getting everything figured out, and we're not going to accomplish that on this call today. But this will be a long process, but it's a process that starts today with conversations like this, and hopefully like this all over the country. So I thank you very much for being part of today's dialogue and discussion. And I want to thank our featured speakers also for being with us today. Some great friends that are not strangers to, many of us on the call. We start with the Chemung County Executive, formerly the Chemung County Sheriff, Chris Moss. Thank you so much for being here. He was our nominee for Lieutenant Governor in 2014, so he traveled all 62 counties of the state of New York. So he's been at many of your events. He is someone that's doing a tremendous job as county executive. Thank you, Chris, for being here. We have the co-chair of our policy committee, and someone that is a former candidate running for New York City Controller, someone that I lean on a great deal, as we help try to craft the Republican Party's urban agenda, but also he's a damn good economist, and you might see him a lot on Fox Business, NBC. John Burnett. John, thank you so much for everything.
Thank you for having me.
And then, last but certainly not least, someone that was I'm proud to say he's a Buffalonian and always will be. He is our nominee in 2018 for New York State Attorney General, someone that did an incredible job. And I like to say, don't blame me, I voted for Keith Wofford. But we'd be in a lot better shape as a state right now if Keith Wofford was our Attorney General, really bringing law to the forefront, not politics and opinion. as we have with Tish James. But Keith is a senior partner at Ropes and Gray, a very, very prestigious law firm, and he is one of the rising stars in our party. So thank you, Keith, for being here. And I'd like to each of you to kind of open up with your own thoughts of what's going on this last week. I mean, obviously we have a pretty serious situation on so many levels. That I think, an overview from each of you is in order. Keith, why don't we start with you?
Sure. First of all, just making sure I wasn't on mute. But look, everyone has been gripped by the events of the past couple of weeks. Everyone is recovering from COVID. But my overwhelming impulse in this is to not get caught up, although necessarily we are emotionally affected, to not get caught up in the phase of dwelling on how bad things are, but rather to think about how we can react to this and improve the situation. My inbox in my email was filled with emails from organizational leaders, CEOs, talking about the recognition that racism is a problem in America. I think if my parents were still here today, they would say, well, thanks for the headline news. We already knew that. What are you going to do about it? And how do we address this in a constructive fashion? And so while I have incredible sorrow and sadness about the denial of human rights and human decency that happened with respect to George Floyd, it is part of a pattern of incidents that seems to happen every 5 or 10 years in terms of incidents that rise to the level of inciting riots on our streets. I mean, literally, we've seen this pattern now for decade after decade. And so the question is, do we finally have a consensus to do something meaningful about it? And by meaningful, my view is that you have to recognize the true extent of the problem, which is that America has concerns not just with African Americans, but with African American males in particular. And unless we address economic empowerment, human rights, and education, we're not going to get this problem solved. And merely referring to broad concepts of diversity without any attention to the fact that we have a problem rooted in the present and also rooted in history about Black men and Black Americans generally is not going to get it done. The good news is it's an excellent opportunity for us and for our party to be constructive on solutions, because what we're going to see from the other side, I suspect, is more of the same, and that has been proven to have been ineffective over decades with respect to the issues that African Americans and the greater American society care about. So, always tempered by the sorrow and the distress at what's happening, I think we just got to really look forward and think about how we can address this in a constructive and positive way as Americans.
Very good. County Executive.
Certainly. First of all, I'd like to thank the chairman. I mean, these are discussions that aren't held frequent enough. On behalf of Chemung County, my condolences to the family of George Floyd. And I think we obviously need to hold all the officers accountable who were responsible for this tragedy. When we say that, though, I think we have to be careful not to paint all police officers with the same broad brush. We've seen peaceful protests and marches throughout the United States over the past couple of days, and I think it sends a powerful message to the long-term injustices, and that's a good thing. But it's very painful to watch the rioting, which is totally different. I mean, as you watch looting and assaults and criminal mischief, it's just incredible to see that in this day and age. When people ask me if I'm surprised, I say, no, I'm not surprised, to be honest with you. And from a law enforcement standpoint, I think it was a bad precedent right from the start when we allow police cars to be burned, when we allow a police station to be overrun, the police officers have to exit. I mean, in New York State, I'd like to think we do a little bit better job just because we have what's called the Municipal Police Training Council. They meet quarterly to set rules, review rules. I mean, over the last couple of years, they've added curriculum about anti-racism, implicit bias, problem solving, use of force. I mean, New York State has model policies for law enforcement agencies throughout the entire state that they can adopt. I mean, in New York State, the minimum amount of time that a person has to go to the police academy for 705 hours, but the average throughout the academies is 1,120 or 28 weeks. I mean, that's a lot of time for a lot of training. But I think one of the places where we fail is additional supervisory training. Once you become a sergeant or a lieutenant, you go to a 3-week class. After that, there is no more schooling for these individuals who are in positions who should be monitoring and training these new officers. I mean, in many cases, unfortunately, we're dealing with a lack of leadership, whether it's within the department from the police commissioner to the sheriff to the police chief, or whether it's politically. I mean, if you think this is the first time that that police officer from Minneapolis used excessive force and placed a knee on somebody's neck, I'm betting you it's not. There's a culture somewhere in that police department that has allowed this type of behavior for an extended period of time, and now it's come to the forefront, and it was videotaped and made public. If you don't have accountability at the top, you're not going to have it at the bottom. And when we look at what do we need to do to change things, a lot of it does rely on the police. People need to remember police officers have a job now that you can be everything from a social worker to a babysitter. The next minute you're chasing a bad guy down the street. Are we giving them enough resources? Are we giving them enough training? I see this big conversation on 50A, which currently prohibits the release of personnel records. I was in law enforcement over 30 years. I was the county sheriff for over 13 years. You could look at my record anytime. No police officer should be afraid to have their record looked at by the public. If you're doing the job right, the way you were trained, then why would you be afraid to have that record shared? So, I mean, there's a lot of work to be done on the police side, a lot of work to be done on the public side. We need to come together and try and find common ground. But I would ask everybody to remember, every profession has bad apples. Law enforcement is no different. But we have thousands of police officers out there that go to work and do a great job every day. And unfortunately, like any other profession, we have those that shouldn't be wearing a badge and carrying a gun.
Interesting points. John Burnett.
Well, I pledged a fraternity, and one of the poems that we had to learn is a poem called If. And part of that poem states, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two imposters just the same. Many times when we have a good economy, we think that all of the issues are resolved. And then something happens that makes us, really think about, what, there's still a lot of work to do. And then obviously, we all were confronted with the disaster that happened in Minneapolis. And I'm quite sure we all watched the video. What was most troubling to me, and it was very painful, when a grown man calls on his mother, that's deep pain. And I think what America saw, they didn't see mercy. They saw a police department that is policing the community, but not policing with the community. As Sheriff Moss said, that, there has to be a level of accountability. They can't do their jobs without the community, and the community needs them. There's calls for defunding the police, which is completely ridiculous. But we thank you for having this call, Chairman, because one thing that is missing is listening. And if we actually get to the point where we can listen and have a dialogue where it's not just one way, I think we can actually get to that level of accountability. We can actually, as Keith pointed out, we can address the law enforcement divide with the community, as well as address some deeply seated issues. My mind goes back to Eric Garner. And while everyone talked about the situation, which they should have, my mind was like, wow, how did Eric Garner end up on that corner? How did George Floyd end up in that situation? If we actually can address education, right? All opportunities for everyone, where no one is trapped in failing schools and districts. If we can actually have a society where everyone can pursue happiness, and that happiness in many instances is buying a home, investments. It's mind-boggling that we are a nation that represents freedom and capitalism, but yet we never teach that. we never actually provide that on-ramp where people can go as fast as they want and as slow as they want in terms of pursuing their dreams. So there's a lot of things that we need to be doing locally and nationally, so that way we can heal, but also make some systematic changes in various areas of our society to make sure that we not only improve race relations, but we can actually give people an opportunity to lift themselves up.
Very good points. You know, my pastor last week said we need to be slow to speak, but quick to listen. And I think, you know, that I've heard no, you know, more salient point, you know, during this than that, you know, that we need to listen to everybody's perspective. I mean, I think we have 24-hour cable news, which I think was the beginning of a lot of our problems in this country, where there's just so much void for content that it's become just opinion-driven information that is trying to echo what you already are thinking. On top of the fact, social media has been, you know, really no friend, you know, to the better part of dialogue. We're more interconnected than ever, but we're also more divided than ever since social media became so prevalent. So, you know, a discussion forum like this, you're going to have an opportunity to ask questions, either the raise your hand function, or you can type a question to us, and we're going to try to get to everything we can. Let's get right into it. To me, it feels like we're stuck on a perpetual hamster wheel of everybody taking sides, either whether it's for law enforcement or for the minority community. It's one or the other. It's really getting us nowhere. And I've been encouraged to see many members of our law enforcement community speak out about George Floyd's death, because no one hates bad cops more than good cops. But I'm also disturbed by the violence being perpetuated against police officers because of the uniform that they wear. And we know that good policing saves lives, it saves Black lives. And we saw it in New York City, where the murder rate went from over 2,000, you know, down to 318 in 2019. So how do we tackle this mistrust and divide? And what are some reforms that will allow law enforcement to do their jobs effectively in a way that, you know, Blacks and Black men in particular, they don't feel targeted, they don't feel harassed, or become the victims of excessive force? I mean, what should policing look like here in the year 2020? I mean, this is the million-dollar question that's in front of everybody right now. So, you know, I'm counting on the three of you to unpack this for us.
Well, first of all, I would say what you have to keep in mind is you have police departments at every level. We have local police departments, we have county sheriffs, we have the New York State Police. Training is different for all of them. Some of them have lots of resources, some of them have no resources. And again, some of them have no accountability, some of them have accountability. One of the things I'd like to see is mandated accreditation across New York State. I think last I knew I'm not sure the number of accredited police agencies. But when you look at that, those are standards that they have to abide by. The state frequently checks to make sure that you're meeting the qualifications to get the accreditation in the first place. If we start tying financial resources to that accreditation process, I mean, that's a great thing, as opposed to, you know what, if your department doesn't have accreditation status, you're not going to get this equipment or that loan or so forth. Somehow we have to force the training. Look, the governor appoints the Municipal Police Training Council. He approves all the appointments to that council. So if he wants to go in a certain direction and say, okay, we need 16 more hours of this type of training, he can do that. So whoever's the governor at the time, and we know who it is this time, and he said he wants to see changes, let's see him approach that PTC and make the changes.
Okay. How about you, Keith? What do you think here?
Look, I think that we have to draw a contrast between many on the left who seem to think that there is a double-digit percentage of police forces that are effectively closet Klansmen. You know, this notion that there can be all this systemic racism but no racist, it just doesn't make any sense, right? So I think we have to draw a contrast between those who say that there are these massive numbers of corrupt and racist police, and those who truly believe that most police are honorable civil servants trying to do their jobs, but there are some egregious aberrations that we've just got to stop. People who just don't recognize the humanity of African Americans and African American men the way they recognize the humanity of others. And so I think you have to have screening at the front end to make sure that you try to identify people who are going to become problems. And I think you need a more effective system internally within departments, that if you have people who build up records of being repeat offenders, that they are removed from police forces and frankly never serve in another law enforcement force again. Because I think if we do draw that contrast and make clear that we're just not going to tolerate aberrant policing, it's going to deal with these tail risk events. I mean, this one came out of Minnesota. When you think about the number of law enforcement agencies, the number of jurisdictions in America, unless we deal with this tail group, this aberrant group, we're not going to get anywhere on this. We're going to be exposed to these sorts of consequences over and over and over again.
Well, one thing I like to point out is that I've never seen in history a situation that happened like it did in Minnesota, where the police officers were fired within 48 hours and the FBI and DOJ were sent in. And you had Fox News and CNN, you had the left and right. There was no sunlight between anyone. Everyone saw the same thing. But we also know that there are other situations where it's not as conclusive. You know, a couple of years ago, I went to training, Citizens Academy training, and they put you through certain scenarios. And let me tell you, I made a lot of mistakes that would have cost me my life. And I made some mistakes that it could have actually led to a fatality of someone else. So I think that training is good. Of course, you can't train 325 million citizens, but if we can train a lot of individuals to see it from the police perspective, but at the same time, part of that training that Sheriff Moss mentioned, County Executive Moss mentioned, is that I think there needs to be other training to show it from the citizen's perspective. And I think that's extremely important, because many times they see it from one perspective. And I think bringing both sides together, part of that training is important. And like County Executive Moss said also, in terms of the level of accountability. The thing is that, you know, I have a corporate background. So we have policies, we have training and so forth, all to make for a good culture, high ethical standards. But part of that culture is employees understanding what those values are, and the employees tapping other employees on the shoulder when they see those employees about to do wrong or are doing wrong. So part of this is also changing the culture on the other side of the blue wall, making it okay for other officers to say, hey man, you know what, that's enough pressure. Oh, you know, we can stop now. There is no threat. We have to get to that point where we're changing the culture, where that 99% of good officers can actually start molding and shaping a renewed culture that doesn't tolerate certain things that lead to fatal outcomes. And I think, as again, Moss had mentioned, in terms of that level of accountability, tying it to resources, because when there's resources on the line, that tends to start shifting behavior. So if we do a combination of all these things, listening, training, two-way, right, and also addressing the societal systemic issues in terms of education, in terms of access to capital for those that want to start a business, and other issues in our society, then we can actually move forward. And look, we already know that we're the party that abolished slavery. We're the party that overwhelmingly voted for civil rights. But that torch is now passed to us in this modern day, where we're confronted with calls to defund the police. There's calls to do all outrageous things. We have to be the party to say, you know what? Let's bring everyone together for material and sustainable changes.
Yeah, as those black business owners whose businesses were burnt down in the inner cities, what they think about the defunding of police. Absurd.
There's a lot there. So let's talk about the concept of systemic racism. The racism or bigotry that is not as obvious on the surface, but it's still acutely felt by people of color, and has maybe played a role at some point in their life from preventing them from reaching, God-given potential. I think one of the things that I personally want to learn more about is how to be more cognizant of that, and where and how it exists, and what can we all do to help change that.
I think, first of all, we need to deal with the stereotypes. I can tell you, we have 24 hours of in-service training when I was the sheriff, and we earmarked part of that to diversity training. We just started that maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and you would be surprised at the stereotypical comments that people just don't understand or they don't know. And I'd like to think I have a unique perspective, obviously, with having a law enforcement background, being an African-American. I mean, it's very, when you bring a group of people together in upstate New York, in my area, very few minority policemen, number one. That really doesn't help the issue. We've tried to recruit more minorities to be police officers. It's very hard to do. But I think until we get past a lot of these stereotypes and get the communication gap fixed, where we're talking about having these hard conversations, I think we're going to have a hard time getting to second base.
Well, I will say that, the one thing I agree with President Obama on that I saw yesterday was it's time to have an uncomfortable conversation. And, as a Republican Party, I think we have a duty to have an uncomfortable conversation to try to, figure out how to have better connections here. Keith, what are your thoughts on the systemic issues?
Well, look, there's a long list, right? Number one is I think you have to start changing the reality on the ground in these communities. You have to improve the ability to make a living. You have to improve the education level. Both of those, of course, go together. You have to improve the opportunities for people and the sense of hope of people for their children. And, until we start doing those things, it's going to be very difficult to drive away the stereotypes, right? I mean, I think some of that training is helpful, but ultimately you have to give back to these communities the ability to control their own destiny. And we have a bunch of liberal policies, a bunch of left-wing policies that are universally counterproductive. You have, folks fighting to keep kids of color and particularly, young black boys and girls from having access to charter schools where they could improve their lot, even though they're proven to work. You have a bunch of commercial policies and government policies about small business that seem almost, designed from, some sort of unseen hand to make it impossible to get capital in these communities. We talked about policing and the importance of police to these communities. And I remember the problem when I was a kid was that the police were accused of not supporting and protecting communities of color and protecting the inner city, that they would only stay in the good neighborhoods. And now, 30, 40 years later, this is reversed, where you have segments of the community, but really more segments of liberals who don't live there, saying that the police should effectively withdraw, let people loot and burn down buildings, and let people riot rather than peacefully protest. And by the way, that we should defund the police departments. The fact of the matter is these liberals don't live in the communities. They will never themselves serve in a police force. And we have to take the police and make them the best police force we can with the police we have, many of whom, as you know, are not minorities, but have served or volunteered to serve and protect at relatively low wages communities that don't look like them. So I think we have to start recognizing the reality of who our police force is, bring out the best in that group, get rid of the bad apples, and change the reality on the ground in terms of how these communities control their own destiny.
Yeah, I think that one of the things is really just showing up. We have the better message, but also sometimes that message it can get a little stale. Many times it needs to be refreshed. We talked about education on this call. We're a diverse society, and even in the Black community, there's diversity. So why is one size fits all education model? Why is that good for anybody? Right? When we talk about diversity, we can our ideas are diverse. When I hear liberals talk about charter schools being the civil rights issue of our day, that's insanity. Why? Because it actually empowers more Black and brown individuals than white individuals. If anything, it's providing an opportunity until such time that the whole system could be actually changed. So we have to point out, the systemic issues in education. We have to also point out, when you look at our diversity as a nation, right? When I go on vacation, there's always some little kid walking up to me wanting to sell me something. Why? Because part of that family survival is small business. So entrepreneurship is actually in our DNA, every person. This is a capitalistic society, but we don't actually teach the tools necessary to be able to open business, to understand investments, right? When I talk to children in the neighborhood and mentor, those are skills that they are hungry for. And when you actually speak to that inner chromosome that's yearning to be free and giving them the information that is needed, that changes attitudes, that changes perspective. So we have the right ideas, we have to show up, and we also have to figure out a way to properly message those ideas so that way we can actually start changing the systemic issues. And one of the issues is interaction with police. That's not the end all be all. Many times that's the trigger that ignites the issues. But there's a myriad of different things that we have to address. And it really ties to economic issues as well as other social issues that we just have the answer for.
Well, that kind of leads us to the next question, and several of you, came to the topic a little bit on your own. But one of the things that I, as chairman of the party, whether it was my time as county chairman or now as state chairman, I've been very frustrated as a Republican, is our inability to earn the trust of Black voters and to cultivate support in the Black community. And I feel, John has brought up some great points as to why our message should do very well within the Black community. But I think we all feel like Democratic policies are keeping people trapped in a lifetime of dependency. My perception's always been that it's a very paternalistic approach, that minority communities need them to provide for them. And that's the Democrat way. I mean, meanwhile, they go, to war against schools. The New York City Housing Authority is a total disgrace. Their policies hurt jobs and the economy. There's clearly a disconnect into who they believe has the better policies and their best interest at heart. All of our speakers on this call have run for statewide or citywide office, or back in 2014 when Chris Moss ran as lieutenant governor under Rob Astorino. Our party had the most diverse statewide ticket in history, more diverse than the Democrats. But Black Republicans are treated worse in many ways, or they're ignored as an anomaly. We have no future as a party if we don't fix this. And I know it won't happen overnight, but what are some of your thoughts on where we're missing the mark as Republicans, and what can we do better to earn support in the African-American community around the state of New York?
Well, one of the things that we said we were going to do after the 2014 elections, we were going to start hitting colleges. We were going to open our tent up to people that looked different and so forth. I'm not sure that we've taken a great opportunity to do that. The Democrats seem to outmaneuver us in colleges. I mean, the message that goes to college students, whether they're registered or just registering, is a Democratic message. I think we have to do a better job of trying to reach out and communicate with African-American communities with all the vote totals that we're not getting. It's hard to do, and I'm not sure what the game plan is, but as we continue to try to grab one of these statewide offices, without a big plan in the New York City area, it's going to be very tough to do. So I hope any future plans, deal with how do we spread the message effectively? How do we spread the message that, the GOP message is very important to the African American community. And I'll tell you, in a lot of cases, even locally here in upstate New York, traditionally, a lot of African Americans vote black. Democrat. They don't care about the candidate, about the issues a lot of times because their parents did. They're Democrats, they're traditional Democrats, and they don't look at the candidates as much as they should. I mean, it's an interesting comparison as to what happens.
So there are a couple of things we should do. The first thing we should do is we need to have a scorecard of how the Democrats and liberals policies are working for African Americans as well as for Americans generally. Let's talk about how those kids are doing in their communities and schools. Let's talk about how the police have performed in Democratic controlled cities over the decades of Democratic control. Let's talk about how housing authorities have been performed. Let's talk about how the cost of living will be driven up by the policies of the Green New Deal and of the left. More expensive heat, more expensive electricity, less opportunity to grow business, more regulation. So first we keep a scorecard as to how's that working for you, African American community. But then the second thing we have to do, and this is the more difficult part, is we have to have policies that concretely and affirmatively speak to Black educational and economic empowerment, not just as a side means of finding ways to channel money to other sectors of the party, but because we believe that the future in America, being good and being just, means that we as a moral and cultural imperative have to lift up people who have historically been excluded and stop wasting the human capital that we as a country have been wasting. I believe if we do those two things, number one, give a scorecard on how's that working for you, and number two, say, look, we've got ways consistent with Republican values that are going to make you a lot better off, and we're not just withdrawing and saying there's no alternative, hate their policies but vote for us. I think if we do both those things in the long run, we'll be successful.
Why did I ever run for office? So here's the thing, right? So I was always a corporate person, keeping my head low to the ground, focusing on execution in terms of corporate strategy and so forth. But I ran for office in 2013, and you know what I heard continuously, even before and after. I came in second place, but because I refused to say I lost, I came in second place. Are you going to stay around? Or are you going to just drift away like everyone else? I took that personal, as though I'm just running for my own benefit. So that's the reason why I'm still around. That's the reason why I haven't fell off, right? And to Chris's point, is that we have to show up. The Democrats have a great marketing campaign, right? If you drill a message day after day, that message is going to be stronger, even though it's a false message. That message will be stronger than candidates coming around during election time, no matter how diverse the ticket is. So we have to go on the college campuses. We have to almost, without an evangelic tone, we have to evangelize what our policies are. We can't just only attack the Democratic policies. We have to play offense. We have to come with our own policy ideas, to Keith's point, in terms of having that scorecard, why that doesn't work, and then why these plays and playbook will actually empower you, and have a continuous plan of communication and engagement, not just diversity, but inclusion. So that way we can have, and not just ambassadors, to the point where anybody can carry a message. When I speak to a lot of people in the community, they say, well, why don't they sound like you, John? right? So the thing is, if we can actually carry that same message through the lens of empowerment, it's not enough to say lower taxes. They don't know what lower taxes really means, right? We have to break the message down. We're the party of business, but we're terrible at one of the key fundamental things of business, which is strategy. And strategy brings every key element of business together. So and I think you're doing a great job, Nick, in terms of even this call and so many other things that you were doing before COVID and you're doing now, even amid the pandemic, and that you'll actually keep the momentum even hereafter. We just have to make sure we're mobilizing from New York to the southern tier, all the way, all throughout the state, to make sure that we're carrying the message, playing offense, not with a nasty tone, but just with a good set of ideas and logic and reason.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you for all that you do to help us continue that mission. And we've done the very best we can. I mean, I felt very strongly, when I ran for chairman, that we could only grow a Republican Party if we went to communities that we've ignored for far too long. And that's why I spent the time last year to go to all 62 counties in the state, but also, to go to, different ethnic communities. And, whether it's trying to, cultivate, Republican support within the Asian community or the Latino community or the African American community or the Caribbean American community. There are so many opportunities in a state this diverse. I mean, we need to grow the party. The party needs to look like New York State if we're going to win again.
Can I just add one quick point, Nick, on that? And I thank you because like you said, I mean, you were all over the place, 62 counties, right? And you couldn't attend this one dinner, and you had asked me to attend that dinner. And I looked, I said, wow, do I want to drive 7 hours each way? And I looked at the train schedule. I thought, okay, maybe I can get there in 3.5 hours on the train. I looked at it. I'm like, based upon the schedule, that's 6.5 hours each way, even on the train. I said, you know what? I can't complain. I got on that train, went there, I spoke. And you know what they said? They said, wow, you came all the way up here from New York City to be with us? We only have about 40 people here. That's amazing. I said, you know how you're feeling right now? That's the same way Black people will feel when you show up. So remember that feeling, because if we actually get out there, have a plan of engagement, playing that offense, we have the winning message in the policies. We just have to deliver it.
And we're going to do that. We got a lot of questions. We have so many questions, and we don't have enough time to get to them all. But I'm gonna start with some of the written questions here. And obviously, we haven't talked a ton about the rioting and the looting and things that have gone on here this week. But Michael Atchison, thank you for your question. There seems to be a large group of peaceful protesters, and then there's another group of mostly white people dressed in black, which seem to be using the protest to act out violently, seemingly for their own purposes, which does not seem to relate to police excessive force against black males. What's everybody's take on that?
I mean, obviously, I know over the weekend, Rochester, Buffalo, Syracuse, some of our upstate cities were hit. But, as I watched the television coverage, I mean, obviously, you have peaceful protesters and then you have rioters. And most of the peaceful protests were before the sun went down. I got to be honest with you, when you looked at the curfews and so forth, I'm not sure why they're not being enforced. I think better decisions need to be made at the local leadership level. I think a lot of times people are afraid to say, well, you know what? If we don't let them blow off some steam, it's going to get worse. Or how are we going to be perceived by the rest of the country or the rest of the state? Look, people should peacefully protest all they want. It's a great idea. But you know what? When the sun goes down and we're looting and assaulting people, killing people, it's time for the police to take action. do what they're paid to do. It's time for local leaders to step up and say, okay, these aren't protesters. These are rioters. Let's take care of business. So it's unfortunate. We're going to have to weed through all this to see who's involved. I mean, when I see a pallet of bricks being dropped off at a corner, is that accurate? Who dropped them? How does somebody drop off a pallet of bricks at the corner, put caution tape around it, and nobody sees it and ask a question until the rioters get there? I mean, there's a lot more to this story I think we're going to see in the coming days and the coming weeks. But it's tough. The police have a tough job to do.
Keith or John, you want to jump in here on the outside groups?
Well, I think it's obvious that there were, and actually still going on. So there are outside groups. Anytime that there is an opportunity to come together, and again, as I said from the outset, there wasn't an ounce of daylight between generally opposing sides on that issue and fatality. And I think when you have pent-up anger, 40 million people, another 1.8 million on unemployment, and people are in desperate situations and lockdown and quarantine for months, there's a lot of anger in the streets, not just black, but black, white, brown, every color. And I think there are certain groups that capitalized on that need. And we've seen it down through history when there's good, people come in to try to undermine that good and try to blow up the situation when they see that there's an opportunity for change. But with that said, we can't lose focus. We have to deal with the current situation, the rioting and looting, that has actually impacted black, white, and white businesses. Many of these communities, when the dust settles, because we're still in a pandemic, many of these individuals, the very stores that they actually go and get their food and groceries from, now they now they're challenged with accessing, basic essentials. So we have to restore law and order, but we also have to keep in mind, again, going back to what we're discussing, these systemic issues, and handle all these things at the same time. I think law enforcement is trying to the best of their ability to restore law and order, but at the same time show, yes, we get it, we hear you. But many times that is lost amid anger. But hopefully it's subsiding, and hopefully we can get back to a place where we can actually talk and move to solutions.
There is an element that appears to be organized and bordering on insurrectionist. We have to find out whether there is an organized element that is extrinsic to the communities or not. These rioters need to be arrested. To the extent that we can, we confiscate the cell phones and investigate whether there's some organizational principle or coherence behind it. And to the extent that there is a group or groups that are effectively trying to destroy our cities under the cover of peaceful protest, they need to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, period.
And I'm not a sheriff or a law enforcement officer, and I never went to law school, but I got a JD in law and order in terms of watching the program. The average person can look and see that this is an organized insurrection. From the bricks to it's the same playbook in every city, the exact same thing. In fact, I had colleagues in the UK sent me video. It's the same thing happening in the UK. When my mind goes back to some of the things that I discuss on campus at NYU, one of the principles of Marxism is the call for revolution, to undermine the current system, to implement a system of communism. And that's an extreme, but when I look at it, I've never seen the country at a situation where it's 9 days of straight riots, even near the White House in DC. So this has to be a concerted effort. This has to be well organized. And like everyone said, I think at the end, when the investigation is done, I think that'll actually materialize.
Yeah. Look,
Yeah.
one more note, which is that these cities that have effectively allowed this to go on and allowed small businesses, many minority owned, to be destroyed, need to indemnify those businesses. I think one of the things we could very constructively propose as a party is an influx of capital to basically undo the damage that, police forces who were told by their leadership at the political level to withdraw or to allow this go on. I mean, we're collectively responsible for that. Those people didn't deserve to have their businesses destroyed. They're in a position where they have a risk that is basically uninsurable. They couldn't have protected themselves if they wanted to. We need to make that right.
A lot of people point to the fact that you have outside influences, outside groups, anarchists. You see some of the tagging and the graffiti that I witnessed, through media in Buffalo, with anarchy and Antifa-like activity. I mean, do you fear that the message that people originally came together on is being lost by all of the violence and the looting and the distractions from what we were originally, having protests for?
I certainly hope not. I know in Elmira there's a protest planned for tomorrow. It's supposed to be a pretty good turnout, and we've had meetings to make sure it's done safely and so forth. And on a side note, one of the concerns that you mentioned, COVID-19. I've got to be honest with you. We're tracking from Memorial Day, where a lot of people were out. Now the riots or the marches, where a lot of people were out. 14 days from now, if we see a spike in this, well, I mean, you talk about an issue, and unfortunately, it's really the perfect storm where people have been locked up. I think, like John mentioned, not locked up, but locked inside for 8 weeks now. They haven't been able to do anything. They can't go out to a restaurant. They can't go to a bar and get a drink. So I mean, now they're allowed to go out and participate in these marches. They can have their friends come, and they can talk to them. I mean, I'd be surprised to really grab a couple of these folks. Tell me what the victim's name is. Tell me something about the victim. I just think we've gotten so far from legitimate marches and protests to the looting and so forth. But I hope the message doesn't get lost, because there's still a lot of good people out there that are trying to get the message through. And at the end of the day, hopefully their message will be stronger than, the looters and the rioters.
Okay, we have a question here directly for Chris Moss. Could you speak to the issue of the public worker unions, including the police unions, which have inordinate power to protect their members from accountability? Relatedly, Mr. Moss mentioned a 50A statute. Should that be reformed or repealed?
I mean, I think I mentioned I would repeal it. Look, if you're a police officer and you're doing your job and you were doing what you were trained to do, hopefully you were trained correctly, there's no reason. And I think Keith mentioned earlier, you know what? If I'm a cop that has a history of excessive force and I transfer to another department, my record doesn't go with me. So if you transfer across the county to another department, that department doesn't get to see that you had 15 complaints, because if they did, they would never hire you. So you know what? I think we do need, that's part of the problem. We do need to repeal it. If you're a cop doing your job, you shouldn't be afraid to have your record scrutinized by a prospective employer, the public, a complainant, or whoever. So I would be in favor of amending it or repealing it. Obviously, we want to be careful not to give out information in reference to families and so forth of police officers, because they can become targets. But we do have to remember that I'm a firm believer that if you do your job, you got nothing to hide from.
Larissa has written in, first of all, thank you for your time today. I'm an educator in a local school district within Monroe County. For me, quality education is key to create responsible, productive, and socially contributing citizens. I feel that we have many misinformed and unschooled young people. Civics education is considerably lacking in our schools. What issues and reforms do you feel that need to be a priority and addressed in our schools to help with the current situation in our nation? Keith, you've been obviously someone on the forefront of education across both your hometown of Buffalo, but across the state. We'll start with you here.
Look, there've got to be more quality seats for students and families that want them. personally don't care whether it's vouchers, charter schools, any sort of high quality public schools, specialized programs within public schools. Any way we can improve the number of quality seats and improve the consensus around discipline and stability and excellence in education, as opposed to just throwing money down a hole, which we've done for years, would be an improvement. I think you have to have higher aspirations for these kids and not tell them that you expect them to fail, which we seem to explicitly and implicitly do all the time. I think that we also have to look at the directness and concentration of our failure with both African American children and with Black boys in particular. The system's not dealing with Black boys well at all. The dropout rates, the low level of performance, it's not reflective of the talent of these kids. And we talked about the campaign last year about the school to prison pipeline quite a bit. All the people talking about it have done absolutely nothing to reform it. So we really have to focus on this issue generally in terms of making quality seats available, and also in terms of even within traditional public schools around curriculum. The lack of history education is appalling, absolutely appalling. I mean, we talk about math and science, but we don't talk about the fact that children are taught in both public and private schools more about countries halfway around the world than they're taught about America. And the product of that is that we get a disconnected view of these kids in terms of how they view America and the strengths of America and the weaknesses of America. People just don't understand this country and the great things that it's done and the great things that we've overcome, and put our mistakes, even when we make mistakes, which we do, in proper context. And we've got to have better history education to start that process, along with math, along with science. I mean, basically, we just got to get rid of the junk food, frankly, and really focus on something that these kids can benefit from and that our society can benefit from by generating better citizens.
Anything to add, John?
Well, there are models that are actually working. The 100 Black Men of New York, they have, I think it's up to 6 schools now where it's all young Black boys. And I think they have almost 100% graduation rate, almost 100% going to college. That's a model that's working. So we should actually take what's working and see if we can scale it, not just for Black boys, but also Black girls, right? So I think, again, a lot of things I'll reference to, it relates to business, but, those principles transcend to, modifying certain things in society for the betterment of society. And I think competition is good in terms of independent schools, charter schools, public schools, and so forth, bringing about that level of accountability and education. And also, I think, what we talked about is listening, and we also talked a lot about seeing different perspectives. I volunteer for Pencil. It's public education needs civics and learning, right? So I volunteer every once in a while to be a principal in a public school. I walk in, I even sit on some of the classes. And to the extent of, if it's a subject that I understand, even participate in some of the lessons. And what I observed, and I'm not knocking any teacher, and I'm saying to myself, wow, these are not employable skills. They're not actually teaching things that should be taught. Even when I sat on courses related to business, it's an outdated model. So not only do we need to update the curriculum, as Keith pointed out, but also bring the level of technology and the level of different school models. I'm the 7th child, the son of a pastor. There's a lot of churches that would love to have their own school. So there are opportunities where we can take it, where people worship. That's actually community. If we have the work, whatever God you serve, if you can have a school that's associated with it, That's dynamic in terms of changing the culture. You change the minds, you change the culture, you change the community. That's empowerment.
We have, we're in a little bit of overtime here, and I hope you'll all be able to humor me for a few more minutes because there's so many people that want to weigh in here. Michaela, we're bringing her on the line now. Welcome, Michaela.
I thank you so much, Chairman, for hosting this event, and thank you, all of you, for sharing your insights today.
Okay. What's your question, Michaela?
There we go. Hi, I was just wondering how everyday conservatives like myself can help create that culture of transparency and accountability that you have all mentioned and help restore trust in our institutions.
Well, I think on a federal and national level, looking at equality, they ought to be focusing on education and jobs and housing for the underprivileged. On a local level, I mean, we really need to work with the lack of a positive role model in the lives of many of our African-American kids, at least in our community. There's such a lack of respect for the police. I can tell you, when I hear things that come out of kids' mouths about the cops now, my mother or father both would have knocked me to the ground if I said so. I mean, it's just incredible, that lack of respect and what's said and how they're treated. So I think locally we need to focus on that relationship, improving it, and the communication. And I think on the bigger picture, we've got to leave it up to the state leaders and the federal leaders. But it's a tough question.
Look, I actually think that, one of the key demographics electorally is, for lack of a better term, white women. I think that there is a dialogue among certain subsectors of our society, including, majority women, and they need to really, I think you could talk and be an ambassador and say, look, over issues like schools and economic opportunity and justice and human rights, I think that really you should be an ambassador and say, look, it's okay to vote Republican because if we don't get some change on these policies, and some people to say, look, there are other issues that concern us as majority women, but these other issues that are ripping our society apart and leaving all these people behind, these are deal breaker issues. And even though it's not our direct interest, it's America's interest, will you as another majority woman vote on that and help those people who are having trouble crossing the line? They get caught up on, animus toward a particular policy or guns of the president. Look, there's more to keeping our society together than the stuff that the Democrats are bringing. And you got to look at certain candidates, certain issues, and start crossing that line. Because if we don't look at these America issues and have groups get beyond the identity politics and that nexus between identity politics and voting on a couple issues that lead the Democrats to try to peel off elections, we're going to be confronted with a slate of people who just aren't going to get anything done. I mean, that's really the problem we're facing downstate in particular. So to the extent that you can be an ambassador as an American to try to broaden awareness among people like you, that would be extraordinarily helpful.
I'll yield my time so that way we can get more questions in.
We got a question from Dawn, and this is obviously a theme that you hear a lot out there. Many people of color feel there are two different justice systems between blacks and whites. Disparity between arrest, previously stop and frisk, excessive force, and ultimately sentencing. Can the presenter speak on that?
I mean, statistically speaking, I probably would agree. I don't have them in front of me. But again, I think that's probably what a lot of this protesting is about, what's been occurring over a period of time, not just specifically to George Floyd, but you know what? Enough is enough. Now we need to take a stance and see what's going to be done. So I think it has been occurring. But again, I think you really need to look at the data before I could speak intelligently on those numbers.
There is no doubt that there is a deviant subset within certain police forces which regards the humanity of African Americans differently than they regard the humanity of anyone else. I think anybody with a brain and a mind in America knows that if it had been a white woman under the knee of that police officer rather than a black man, there is 100% certainty that the behavior would have been different. So in that sense, there is no doubt as to the veracity of your statement. So we've got a lot of work to do. There are other areas too, but certainly in the sense of being subject to that sort of deviant, dehumanizing behavior, there is unfortunately a disparity.
I definitely concur. We can even see even the enforcement of masks and social distancing in the city. I've seen horrifying situations where how certain police interacted with white folks compared to black folks. So there is a difference, and those are things that we have to address institutionally in how things are enforced. Things should be enforced equally. How laws are enforced in Harlem and East New York, where I was born, should be the same as they're enforced in Central Park on the Upper West Side or East Side. So I think it needs to be a system of equality and a system of fairness. And we already know that the justice system, going back to the '94 crime bill and subsequent laws, without making it too political, that actually created that element of disparity. And I think, again, there's an opportunity to right the wrong. And I think the president has done that with the First Step Act and is working on a second step. But we also have to work on sensible reforms here in New York, sensible that where it works. I don't know if the no bail is actually something that is in the long term that's going to be sustainable.
We have on camera with us now Julie Killian. Hi, Julie. Julie from
Hi.
Westchester.
Julie
And
from Westchester.
yeah, so we've got the last two candidates for Lieutenant Governor on the line.
Hi, Chris.
How are you?
Thank you. Good. Thank you to all of you for being here and being involved in this conversation. And I hope we do more of these because I think digging down into some of these solutions is a good idea. And thank you all for running for office, and especially to Chris, who served in law enforcement and in elected office. But I really want to thank Nick. I just want to, I have a question, but I just want to mention the 62 county thing. I don't think people really realize what that is, because when we ran in 2018, Cuomo had only visited 54 counties, and he had been in office for 8 years. I find that beyond reprehensible that he had not been to every county. So, kudos to you, Nick, for getting to all 62 counties. Anyway, my question, we touched on some of the culture within the police union and education, changing that culture, and then education as a couple solutions. What can we do, though? Much of the disciplinary action that comes within not only just police, but also teachers and any public sector workers comes out of a collective bargaining agreement that is most often negotiated at a local level. I've been involved in those. As an elected official, I've also seen how hard it is to get rid of employees that even have been disciplined and bad employees. And we've even had in our little town of Rye, had a police brutality case. So how do you fix that? People keep saying, they talk about that officer and he had so many disciplinary actions, but he was still on the streets. Chris, especially, is there any way to fix that? And my feeling, and I've said this many times, the unions set up situations and the things that they want and they bargain for, and this happens with teachers too, that they're good for the bad employees, the bad cops and the bad teachers, and they never help the good ones. So I know there's things we can do statewide and there's legislation that can change, but how do we deal with it when most of these things are negotiated at a local level?
The collective bargaining agreements are negotiated at a local level, but it's important to keep in mind if somebody's written up to the point where you're going to try and terminate them, you have to go through New York State Civil Service Law, Article 75, to go through that termination, and that's state law. There's really nothing we can do but follow the guidelines. So it's tough. Even just trying to get. I know one time we tried to incorporate a drug testing within our collective bargaining agreement, and the union fought it. Why would you fight something like that if you're a police officer? Obviously, why would you care? But I mean, it is tough. So I mean, it is a problem that each local municipality, they have to take into account what they're putting in and out of those collective group bargaining agreements. But a lot of the time, disciplinary issues, once you get beyond a coaching or a written counseling memorandum and you go to the Article 75, you are guided by state guidelines to attempt to terminate those people. And then you get an independent arbitrator involved. And we've seen some crazy arbitration decisions that have come back in favor of the employee, you know, and against the municipality. So a lot of times it's not for the lack of effort on behalf of the police chief or the sheriff of the municipality. It's simply left into the hands of an independent arbitrator that rules against you, but it's definitely a problem.
You know, our society is worth fighting for. That's why we have armed forces. To the extent that we need to, we have a draft, right? And we're in a crisis situation. And I applaud the chairman for establishing the Public Affairs and Policy Committee. There's a lot of patriots throughout this entire state. So we will be instituting a draft in terms of tapping on to all this intellectual capacity that we have in the party to serve on certain policy committees. So that way we can actually move from expressing our policy ideas from on social media or on Zoom calls and actually bring that intellectual capacity together to put pen to paper and start really forming some policies. I think that's our duty at this point to save our state and shift the direction of our state. So there's a lot of talented people on this call, and you know a lot of talented people within the party that have subject matter expertise that you know what, not just share their ideas, but willing to put pen to paper so that way we can put up really good policy ideas with the right messaging, so that way we can start shifting this empire state in the right direction.
Yeah, Julie, what we need to do is we need to push, it'll never happen with this lousy set of majorities we have in the legislature, but what we need to do is push for a statewide baseline. You know, the state supports and life supports every single municipal budget in the state, other than the 2 or 3 counties that are run properly. You know, and so what we need to do as a product of that funding is support a minimum baseline in terms of teachers and police officers and municipal employees generally, as far as standards are concerned, because you're right, individual municipalities should not have to fight the good fight against these big unions. Now, look, everything will be challenged in court because it's New York, but that's what we should be, as a matter of accountability to the citizens and taxpayers, demanding.
But to Sheriff Moss's point, when something comes up like that in terms of, I'm sorry, county executive, I got to get used to it, Chris. In terms of drug testing for officers, that's on us. We should step up and actually, whether it's through an op-ed, through messaging of other sorts, to say, look, that is a reasonable request to put pressure to strike that balance. That's a no-brainer to me.
Well, our time has come to a close. We are well into overtime, and I know I respect all 3 of your time. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for participating in this discussion today. And I feel like we just scratched the surface. I apologize to so many people that had their hand up, that wrote questions in that we weren't able to get to. I mean, I don't think we could have gotten to all of the questions had we been on here for 4 hours. But, you know, this was really, I think, great dialogue, a great start. And, you know, we need to continue the conversation, both in forums like this, but, you know, God willing, we'll be back on the road soon and having in-person meetings, because there's an awful lot of places that I know I need to get to and sit down with people and have, you know, meaningful discussions to grow this party. Right. And, you know, anyone that, you know, enjoys this, if you haven't participated, we're going to do a conversation about something going on in the Republican Party each and every Thursday by Zoom around lunchtime. It's a great way for us to communicate as a party, especially in this time, but we found it to be a great tool even going forward. So I thank you for your involvement. I ask you, if you can, please consider supporting the New York Republican Party, at nygop.org. If you can afford to do so at this time, we need to work hard to, continue growing our mission, growing our ranks, shrinking the divide in voter registration. It costs a lot of resources to get that job done. So again, thank you all to our panelists, Keith Wolford, John Burnett, County Executive Chris Moss. Really appreciate the dialogue, and we look forward to talking to you again very soon. Thanks, everyone.
Dick.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman. Thanks, everyone, for attending.